So I've been in the tech industry for over 10 years working as a full stack software developer. And here are some of the most notable software technologies that I've had to learn along my journey and why. I've learned over 40 technologies, but why so many technologies and when did I have to learn them? So in high school, I had a web design class, and there the teachers simply taught us HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in order to build websites. So we built very simple websites using HTML. Then we added a little bit of CSS to style the buttons and style the text and style the website, the background. Very simple stuff like that. We also used Dreamweaver too, but she kind of wanted us, at the time, it kind of sucked. She wanted us to use Dreamweaver, which is like a built website builder at the time, and then learn how to build websites from scratch. But I'm happy she did that because it ended up being kind of a base for me getting into programming. And some people will say like HTML, CSS is not programming, but we did do a little bit of JavaScript, and so it kind of gave me just the foray into using computers, to just seeing you writing some sort of code and then something getting spit out on the other side. So then when I got to college, I actually started college as a mechanical engineer. Then I didn't like the physics. I didn't like the theoretics. It just wasn't for me. And so then I switched to computer engineering and was like, well, this is a little bit better. I'm more interested in it. And then I found out about computer science once I took a couple programming classes. And I was like, this is what I need to be doing. So once I switched majors, then it was kind of off to the races with learning programming paradigms, fundamentals, computer science fundamentals. We started learning C++, was one of the first languages I learned even in the engineering school. We had a programming for engineering class, which is pretty complicated language, but it's great to have started with that language because it's a little bit lower level than some of the language I ended up learning later on. It's less abstraction. And then I moved on to learning Java. I ended up using Java to build a compiler. I learned a lot of object-oriented programming concepts with that, how to create classes and how to create how inheritance works and the solid principles and a lot of things with that. Then I learned C#. I learned that for building like a GUI. I think at the times it was ASP.NET Web Forms or ASP Web Forms. And so I was able to build like Windows applications using C#. C# was very similar to Java. It's kind of like a newer version of Java to me, or a less verbose version of Java. And then I moved on I helped the computer science department build a website and learn more complex web development stuff like jQuery and AJAX. So with that, it allowed me to kind of speed up the JavaScript web development using jQuery. It's kind of like a utility library. And then AJAX is like asynchronous web calls to make a call in the same page without reloading the page, but make a call for some data, get the data back, and update the web page in real time using that data. Now that's you don't even use AJAX anymore. That's just a commonplace thing that happens now. But back then, this is like over 10 years ago. And then scripting. So like I learned just basic in the computer science department, just basic scripting of like FTPing files and logging into servers remotely over the command line and committing code over the command line. A lot of like scripting things and command line stuff. And then I learned console app development as well. Like in the computer science department, a lot of what we built were just console apps where we would just deliver an executable to the teacher. And a console app is just something that just doesn't have a GUI. It just runs a bunch of like command line, runs a lot of code, and it may spit out something to the command line. I went off on my own and I started to do like interview prep, but I also started to do like freelancing work. So that allowed me to really speed up my development and learning like specific things that I would need to build a project. I ended up building like a social media website. And with that, I had to learn Bootstrap, which is kind of like a framework for building websites. It kind of does a lot of things for you. I learned PHP, which is a server-side rendering language, which allowed me to have logic behind the websites that I was building on the server side instead of on the client side, which allowed me to interact with databases. And that's where MySQL comes in. That's a database. So it allowed me to have pages that pulled data from a database and then displayed it on the page. Then I learned Subversion, which is a source control technology. So it allowed me to constantly update my code, but keep version history of it, so that if I need to go back to some old code, I could go back, or if I needed to fork code into 2 paths, I could do it. And that really set up the future for working with a team after that. Then I started to step into mobile app development a little bit. I used Cordova, which is like build a website and then put it in the frame of an app, like using a web view, which was kind of like a very poor man's version of an app back then, but at least got me started in that kind of area with doing mobile apps. Then I started actually really trying to learn how to natively build a mobile app. So I learned back then Apple primary language for iOS apps was Objective-C, and then eventually they shifted to Swift language. And so I learned Objective-C. Objective-C is definitely verbose. It was probably a pretty different language. And I only ever learned it using for iOS native development. Then I learned Google Cloud Platform. So this was like the early days of like cloud hosting. And I don't even remember what I did with it back then. I really didn't understand cloud hosting back then, but I did something with it. So next, I finally got my first job, and there, like, it just kicked off like crazy, because you're in a job, you're getting forced to learn this stuff that you may not learn on your own or want to learn on your own. We started off, it was a Microsoft shop, and we started off learning ASP.NET, I started off working with ASP.NET at the company. So that was building web pages that could update dynamically based on like back-end data. They use Microsoft SQL, MSSQL databases. And then ASP.NET also had web services, and that kind of taught me how to have a front end and a back end that could basically have these web services that the front end could call in order to retrieve data and store data. And that kind of helped me learn that separation of concerns that happens in more modern web development. And then I learned Git, which before I was doing Subversion, but I learned Git, which is a source control management tooling, which most people use today. That's what GitHub uses, and GitLab, and all these other popular public source control housings, repositories, or public, I don't even know what you call them, actually. Then I learned Windows Server because it was a Microsoft shop. So Windows Server is a place where you can host websites or web services or apps on the net. Just like when you think about the concept of like Netflix's servers or a company's servers, like Windows Server is just a type of OS. It's a server OS that can be used to host things. Then like I said earlier, I learned APIs and web services, REST. I learned about what REST is and SOAP and the REST protocol, which is probably the most popular one today. I don't see anybody using SOAP too much anymore, but I learned just basically how APIs work and how different services communicate with each other based on their API, on their application programming interface. And then I learned JSON, which is a transmission format of this data that comes from and to APIs typically. I learned Sass, which is a CSS, sort of like a fancy CSS framework that allows you to write more complex CSS that allows it to be more maintainable, but then it can build into basic CSS that can run in the browser. Then I learned Xamarin, which is a cross-platform mobile app framework, which allows you to build in C#, which was my strongest language at the time, because my job at the first job was using mostly C#. Allows you to write one code base in C#, and then the app can be produced to iOS and Android at the same time from the same code base without you having to use Objective-C or Java. You can just use C# and Xamarin, which Xamarin, I don't think it exists anymore. Then I learned about packages, NPM and Nuget, NPM for JavaScript and Nuget for C#. I learned about like third-party packages where you can, instead of reinventing the wheel, you can pull in these third-party packages from people that have already done it, and they make public some package that would allow you to reuse it in your application based on their whatever criteria they have for using it. And so I learned about packages at that time. Then I learned about Vue once like JavaScript frameworks started becoming more popular. Vue is a JavaScript framework that allows you to write web applications a lot faster in a framework with a team, because you're all going to be using the same framework and building things the same way, and it speeds up the development and maintainability of the web application because you're kind of like forcing it into a framework, into a box of tools that you can use. Then I learned about Webpack and Babel, and which are just like web application building tools. I won't go too deep into those. Bulma is a web, I think it's what do I call it? I think it's like a design framework or a web framework that allows you to kind of gives you a lot of nice UI elements that you can just add into your app very quickly by just referencing the Bulma library. And then .NET Core, which was like the latest thing I learned in .NET, which is Microsoft's kind of framework that they had for C#. And .NET Core did a lot of cool stuff with where you could build APIs with it and console applications and web apps. And so I started using that at work when we got to that point. And then outside of work during this time while I was working, I had side projects and I was still doing freelancing. With that, I learned AWS, which became super popular over the years. To now, it's like the biggest cloud provider in the world. And so I learned how to build applications there. I learned how to set up Linux servers, which is similar to Windows Server I spoke on earlier, like a server OS. I learned how to set that up and host web services there, host websites there. Set up Nginx, which is like a web proxy, I guess is what you would call it, or sort of technology that you put on a server in order to field requests and proxy requests to where they need to go on your server. So let's say you get a request for a certain website, it can proxy it, it can load balance, it can do a lot of different things to help you get the request to where it needs to go. And then I learned PostgreSQL, which is just another type of database. I learned that for some particular reason. Then I finally learned Node and Express, which I had been waiting for a long time to learn that, which is a JavaScript technology that doesn't run in the browser, but it runs on the server side, which allows you to build APIs and web services that your front end can call in order to, as for a web service or that you build in Node and Express. And Express is just a Node framework that lets you build web services. Node is the actual technology that JavaScript runs with on the server. And then I learned React Native, which is another cross-platform mobile app development framework that allows you to use JavaScript this time instead of C#. One shared JavaScript code base, and then you can deliver an app to iOS and deliver the app to Android. React Native is really cool. I actually learned React Native before I learned React, if you know what React is already. Then I learned Next.js, which is a Vue framework. And so that allows you it's a framework on top of a framework. It's a framework on top of Vue that allows you to build web applications even faster in Vue, which is, it just allows you to build like static pages a lot faster just with some of the things they have. Then I learned Tailwind CSS, which is a CSS framework, or more of like a CSS library, which gives you a lot of these nice utility classes that you can use to just speed up your building in CSS. Because if you've ever had to write a lot of CSS with a team, it can get out of control with the hierarchy, the cascading that happens, cascading style sheets. And so it just makes it a lot easier where you don't run into a lot of those problems. Then I learned Firebase, Google Firebase, which is a app backend. So instead of doing like creating a database and web services and APIs yourself and stuff like that and authentication and doing all yourself, you just let Firebase do it, which is a managed backend, which Google handles all the databases and like scaling and partitioning and provisioning and all this stuff for you. And you just build your front end and just connect it to Firebase, and you go in there and just tweak it and turn knobs and tune it and set it up how you want. But like they handle a lot of the heavy lifting for you for a cost. You're going to pay more money to them because they're managing it all. But that's it's a valid trade-off you might want to do. And that's it. I mean, I learned more than that, but I'm just trying to stick to the most notable things. What technologies have you learned, and what are you planning on learning, and why? I hope this is helpful to somebody, and thanks for watching.